Thank you very much for having us. We're delighted and excited to be here. This talk will be presented on behalf of Revo Hub. So today we're going to talk to you about the town centers, and that's probably a topic you've all been involved with and thought about at some length in the past year or more than that. And what we're going to do is look at it from a slightly different perspective, not from what's happening now, but we're going to try and paint a vision of the future of what town centers should be and what we should be aiming towards in a time, maybe in 5 years, maybe later, when the town centers are really attractive and prosperous and the place where everyone wants to be. So we're going to approach this topic from 3 different perspectives. With me here I have Danielle Walker from Philippa Wagner Consultancy, offering strategic foresight and trends forecasting, and Poppy Wilcox from Grosvenor, giving an angle from landlord-led sustainability. And I'm Grigor from Make Architects. We're an architecture practice. So we will take you through what may become of a future town center through several typologies and kind of forces shaping the change. We're not really offering any solutions. We're hoping to kind of give you a positive outlook and to really provide a vehicle for discussion of what may become and what may come in the future.
We know that cities and urban hubs were already undergoing a transformation prior to the pandemic, but what the last 2 years has done has really showed the need for greater systemic change. So the way we work, socialize, travel, communicate, and shop has all been molded by the last 2 years, and there's this ripple effect of change, as you've already kind of heard about today. And we were really inspired by a quote that we saw from Thomas Heatherwick. He told the Times, "People want places which have personality, which dare to be wholehearted. I think it would be a shame if we snap backwards and don't use this opportunity to humanize the world around us." So this really got us thinking about the promise of the town center. What could it be? You know, we think that the town center that's going to win out is the one that's going to be community-driven, based on well-being, and also for everyone. So these are kind of the 3 pillars that we're going to talk about today. So community meaning the town center is centered on the lives of the people who live around there. Emphasis on well-being meaning both personal and planetary well-being, and also for everyone. So meaning it will be accessible, equitable, and mutually beneficial for landlords, businesses, and the people who live there. So we're going to start off with our first pillar, which is community. And I think one of the benefits originally of kind of living in densely populated places, in theory, was that you were going to feel like you're a sense of a community already. But the fact of the matter is urban hubs and city centers have become so dense that we actually don't know our neighbors at all. So prior to the pandemic, 73% of people in the UK didn't know their neighbors' names. Hopefully you know some of your neighbors now. But what the pandemic has done is really forced us to look around us and notice what matters and really highlight this importance of community. So we've seen a rise of informal volunteering, kind of helping out with a neighbor's kid or picking up some grocery shopping. It's up to 33% now, people who do that once a month. That doesn't sound like a very high number, but that's the highest that's ever been recorded by the UK government. So when we think about this from a cultural context, you know, you can't build a community out of nothing. So Faye Bound Alberti says, "To truly belong to a group or a place requires more than a shared interest. It demands a sense of obligation and commitment, something both emotional and practical." So what the pandemic has delivered on a positive benefit is the sense of shared obligation to a community and a realization of its benefits. So we have the stat here from Spotify, that 62% of people want to rebuild society, and they want to do it through community, and what's more, they want the help of brands, developers, and local authorities to rebuild it together. So when we think about this from that consumer context, it means that consumers expect the future of town centers to enhance their sense of community. They need spaces and places that really help them build true connections to the area and are really responsive to their local needs. So we're going to talk about 2 micro-trends that we're kind of seeing in this area. So one is micro-local, which is looking at how retailers can kind of shrink their footprint, be a bit more hyper-local, and embed themselves into the community. And the other is a community supply chain, which is really focusing on self-sufficiency and kind of bringing production closer to the community. So the first one we're going to take a look at is micro-local. So here, as I said, you know, consumers kind of expect their services and products to be more available in their local vicinity. So 65% of UK shoppers kind of had a greater appreciation for their local shops during COVID. So what we're seeing now is a lot of these larger format stores kind of shrinking their footprint, going micro-local, going hyper-local, so they can more embed themselves within that community. So throughout the presentation, we're going to show you some businesses that are leading the way. And the case studies we have here, so there's 3 of them, and these kind of act as signals of how this can be done. So the first is Homebase and Next. So Homebase has partnered with Next to kind of open mini garden centers in their stores, and it allows them to kind of have a smaller footprint and be in places that they might not have been, and it's a bit more personal than being in a big retail park. The other example we have here is IKEA. So IKEA has committed to opening up 40 smaller format stores across the globe, and they're opening up, the first one that they opened up was in Queens in New York, and what's interesting is not just the fact that they're reducing their footprint, but they're also kind of catering to the local needs of the community. So this Queens store kind of features, all the rooms are set up for smaller spaces because people obviously have less space in kind of New York City, and they also have a lot of product ranges that can just be taken out on the day because a lot of people don't necessarily own cars. The last example that we have here is Nike Unite. So Nike really is a brand that's kind of has been focused on direct-to-consumer retail, and they have a lot of first-party data that helps them do that, and it helps them be a lot more hyper-local. So they've opened up a format called Nike Unite, and they use all that first-party data to understand what sports are the people in the area interested. They stock that product to kind of cater to that need, but they're also hiring people from the local area and committing to training them. They offer sports coaching training so that people who work at the store can also be sports coaches for the community. And they talk about the store really existing to serve and celebrate the people in each local community.
Okay, so for each of the examples that Daniela introduces, we're going to think about how this may fit in a UK town centre context. So starting with the micro-local, thinking about how these brands need to integrate themselves in the community, perhaps they should be in the community space in the first place, not in a regular retail unit, but actually out there visible. And what we have here, what we've imagined here, is an existing outdoor area that exists in pretty much every town center. It's either a car park or a back house service area that is underused and doesn't really serve the community. And we're thinking about how we can drive commercial value out of it as well as treat it as public amenity. So if we take the Homebase example, which is traditionally a garden center in out-of-town places, and now going into Next, and think about what that could be in the future. Well, you could have a car park which is curated as a garden center, where people would go to buy plants in their locality, but that could be curated as a park or a garden, so it's actually a place where people can go and linger and enjoy themselves, and take away some of the plants with them. But part of that could also have wild planting as well, so contributing to the kind of biodiversity factor of the cities. And in this landscape, you could have other brands building their own bespoke pavilions. So for example, if you take the IKEA example, targeting the local community, that could be a folly in this landscape that is perhaps has a workshop or some sort of tool borrowing station. So it really targets very specifically what people need and what they want in that area. And similarly, if we take the Nike example, again, building a bespoke pavilion that perhaps is focused around a specific sport, so maybe has a bit of a basketball pitch. And all of this serves as both an amenity and a public space that people can go and discover, and as commercial entity. This is also what we see when people think about the new anchors being public spaces instead of, say, department stores or one specific store. This kind of entity where you'd come for the space, and on the side of that, you might actually end up buying something.
So Daniela mentioned this idea of building from the ground up, and the expectation that developers and local authorities have to be involved in this. But landlords, of course, have a huge part to play in this as well. So this idea of, or trend of micro-local community has seen brands, services, retailers really embedding themselves in the communities that they exist within. And this really means that strong tenant engagement is vital for landlords going forwards to easily understand the community needs. It's, of course, in the interest of the landlord to understand fully what the community demands and to listen to local stakeholders. And this enables them to select brands already aligned with existing community needs to fill vacant spaces, and then also to educate these brands on how to really successfully launch within the context of that specific local community. So this is an opportunity for landlords to help build the spaces and places that their local community want, and to sort of revive them and then to maintain these busy, thriving city or town centres post-COVID. So how can we promote and secure this as landlords? At Grosvenor, we have made a commitment to selectively invest in tenants with either new business ideas or diversification strategies by way of our tenant investment fund. And investing in tenants and in businesses post-pandemic at a time where we have seen and are seeing a lot of uncertainty in the market shows a real confident approach to the future of our city and town centres, building from the ground up. Throughout this process, ensuring that a lot of time and care is really invested in building that sort of landlord and tenant relationship does make sure that the best selections are made that work for sort of mutual success and the community benefiting from that. So working with local stakeholders to enhance the environment where our occupiers and our community are spending time or lingering in this sort of urban garden that we can see here on the screen is really important. And we're going to just touch on an example. So during the pandemic, we saw North Audley Street in Mayfair in central London transform. And this was through landlord as well as local council, tenants and the community itself really working together to facilitate this further outdoor seating at a time when indoor seating was prohibited. And so this involved sort of a restriction on vehicles. We can see that the pavements were widened to facilitate extra seating, and these green features sort of made this network or urban garden. And then within that, the local businesses actually created this sort of network, and we did see that the footfall on this particular street was significantly higher than comparative streets in the area, and it's very difficult to prove sort of biodiversity enhancement, but I do think that the green features was something that really made people feel like they were in a much cleaner and happier, more positive environment. I am now going to pass back to Daniela.
So the second trend that we have within the pillar community is this idea of community supply chain. So another thing that's happened in the last 2 years is our sense of proximity has really kind of changed. So our world, our communities have shrunk down to our neighborhoods, and we realized we need to have a lot more resources available locally. So for instance, the next door app during the first month of the pandemic for us, I suppose that lockdown March 2020, it spiked 80% as people were kind of seeking out their neighbors to kind of get those shared amenities. So what's resulting now is this kind of community supply chain mindset where people are kind of wanting to keep resources local and keeping funds moving also within the community. So it's about helping local businesses and local people alike. In terms of kind of who's leading the way with the community supply chain, firstly we have this app here called Local Node. So this is based in Sweden, and what it does is it connects local food producers with consumers, and they can kind of order from multiple different food producers, and then there are these nodes, these physical meetup points where they can then meet and then get all of their different kind of foods they've chosen in this physical space. Another example we have here is a lot me. So this is kind of like the Airbnb for vegetable patch. So if you have some room to spare in your garden and people want to grow kind of fruits and veg, there can be an exchange that happens there. And what's interesting is that we have seen people attempt to do this in the past, but the need wasn't there so much. So those kind of other versions didn't really work out. Whereas now we've seen a lot more wait lists up to 1,000 people, and I think 2/3 of allotments in the UK have a wait list of between 100 and 400 people. So here it's about how do we provide spaces, shared spaces that can be a resource for the community. The last example that we have here is Peddler, so this is another app, and what this does is it kind of encourages people to participate in the community and shop locally. So you kind of go on the app and indicate what you want to buy, and the more people who indicate they want to buy that thing, you get a reduction on the price, so it goes up to 55% discount. So really kind of tapping into thinking of the benefits of being a part of the community and keeping your money within the local community.
So what does a space that caters to the local supply chain look like? Well, if we start with the examples that Daniela looked at, so the local node and the fact that you're now collecting your produce from a local producer, what could be a great elevated experience is if instead of just collecting at some sort of a fulfillment hub, you actually had the opportunity to meet those producers and talk to them about what is it they do and how they go about producing the food that you're buying. So we've taken an example of an already existing community space, a church that has been repurposed to serve as this fulfillment hub and also as a showcase for small independent producers from the local community that would not be able to afford a full-on shopping unit on a high street or in a shopping mall. So what we imagine here is the people coming to collect their groceries from the local node can actually stay on and linger, and there's perhaps a bit of a performance program, and there are other producers and manufacturers and local businesses represented that you can discover as you come into this community space. So it's a repurposed building which serves different parts of the community and different functions at different times of the day. It does not only have to represent food producers, it could be representing local makers and artists and craftspeople, as we've sort of illustrated here in the upper gallery. And the brands and the apps like Peddler and AllotMe could also be taking up space here, because sooner or later digital communities and digital movements need to proliferate in the physical world. So, for example, Peddler could have its most popular products of the week displayed in this place, changing every week. So people who do not want to use the app but still want to get the benefit of the local spending can still come here and use it. And equally, the churchyard is now turned into a series of allotments which are given over to AllotMe to manage. So people who want to grow their own vegetables can come here and use this without having to have their own patch of land. So what this does really is it gives a physical presence to the local community, and it also helps keep that local spending and keep the resources within the community.
So where is the landlord's part to play here? To harbour this connection between local business and local users, which is clearly key for consumers, means our spaces need to transform to accommodate new businesses in one space, but also varying preferences, which, as we've seen, can change continuously. Understanding and building relationships with key stakeholders has really shown its value, as well as investing into the transformation and repurposing of existing spaces. We've seen that really considered delegation to an appropriate and well-selected operator or manager that really understands or knows a particular community can be really effective. We're going to touch on an example here of Mercato Mayfair. So this is the real-life reusing of a redundant church space, transformed into this sort of hyper-local grocery store with pop-up style restaurants, or perhaps this sort of concept of a fulfillment hub. This is truly an old space given a new lease of life through local business, local community, and local connections. Mercato itself was selected especially as the operator for this, chiefly because they were already invested and embedded within the community. But what the landlord's been able to do and provide is an incredibly flexible model for this operator to make changes and to adapt to consumer demand where appropriate. So, for example, now in the basement, the space is being used as a sort of community hall, village hall type space that can be rented out for various different events. And this ground floor area lends itself to this idea of exhibiting brands, businesses, or artists' work, as we saw in Grigor's future community supply chain space. So there have been opportunities throughout the pandemic for landlords to respond to the demands of the community and really build links and networks. And post-pandemic, this is going to be vital to maintain and cement these. And just briefly before we move on, Daniela mentioned the demand for allotments, which has rocketed. But perhaps the waiting lists need to start transferring elsewhere. We've seen so much disused space in town and centres that could and should have been utilised. And making these initiatives happen is about the community working with landlords and councils to facilitate this. So in Sweden, at our shopping centres during the COVID pandemic, we saw a lot of new allotments springing up. And actually, these proved so popular, but there was so much community engagement that came from these that it actually drove people back in to start using the facilities again and to shop in the shops. And it's really a sign that integrating these new trends into our existing spaces is effective. And of course, a perfect opportunity for landlords to take advantage of these digital apps like AllotMe. Really like epitomizing a full community supply chain.
So now we're going to move on to our second pillar, which is well-being. So when we think about well-being, we tend to think about it as personal well-being. It refers to our personal health, but we can also think about it as collective well-being, so the places and spaces that kind of support the physical and mental well-being of everyone in a community. And then well-being also encapsulates sustainability, so because there's this growing awareness that my health is your health, and your health is everyone's health is the health of the planet, that has also been highlighted by the pandemic as well. So there was one study from the University of Plymouth that found that people who visited natural spaces weekly feel psychologically connected to them, reporting better physical and mental well-being. But it also found that people who are connected to nature were also more encouraged to protect the planet as well. And so there's kind of this symbiotic relationship between planetary and collective well-being. And if you think about it in that cultural context, it's something that's been captured by Tina Norden, who said, "The pandemic had made us think about the well-being of the world and of the people around us. It's now a key factor in how we think about space. Creating people-centric spaces that feel good aids the well-being of their users, and if people feel better, they're going to react to each other in a more positive way. It's a circular thing." So we also know, when we think about this in the consumer context, 80% of people believe that sustainability is inextricably linked to other problems we face, such as poverty, inequality, and social injustice. So what this means is now consumers expect the future of the town center to support not only their personal well-being, but the well-being of the community and the planet as well. And we're seeing this emerge in a lot of different ways, but two we're going to talk about today are self-sufficient communities and wellness architecture. So the first trend we're looking at is self-sufficient communities. So in the way that we saw in community supply chains, there's this drive to come together to benefit and support local commerce. We're also seeing that in relationship to urban well-being as well, this desire to build back better and use resources in a more considered way. One way that we're seeing that is through this self-sufficient community, or the community energy movement, which is about communities coming together to create their own energy grids of renewable energy. And they don't only share that energy, but they're also sharing the economic benefits of producing their own renewable power amongst the community. And this is kind of nascent right now. I think there's 1 million people, citizens, participating in community energy in Europe, but it's predicted to grow to 260 million by 2050, providing 45% of the EU's electricity at that time. And then in the UK in 2019, the community energy movements that we've seen here, they reduced carbon emissions by 65,000 tons, so kind of showcasing both the planetary and the well-being benefits of these types of communities. And in terms of who is leading the way, so Patagonia, which is known for their sustainability kind of efforts, they produced a documentary called We the Power, which kind of highlights this community energy movement and talks about the advantages to both people and to planet about if we had this clean energy transformation. And we're already kind of seeing this attitude embed itself into actual developments. So Hazelwood Green is in Pennsylvania in the US, and this is a 7 million square foot mixed-use development, so it has a mix of residential, retail, office, and light industrial, and they all have different energy loads. And the idea is that there will be opportunity to kind of balance that energy loads throughout the buildings depending on how that energy is being used. This is also something that's being already put to use with Snøhetta Powerhouse. So this is an office space in Norway, and it actually generates twice as much energy as it consumes. So it's effectively acting as a local power plant. So it provides energy to its entire building, and then it outsources the other energy, the excess energy, to buildings, buses, cars, and other businesses on the local grid. So this kind of really is hammering home the point that for people to live and thrive in town centers, the buildings that they live in and work in and shop in also need to be sustainable as well.
Okay, so what does a self-sufficient and energy-efficient town center look like? So starting with some of those examples we've just seen, like energy generation by Snøhetta Powerhouse, we believe that there will be a proliferation of local energy production, and that will be not just in the ubiquitous solar panels that are on roofs everywhere, but as all sorts of sculptural forms of canopies and sheltering devices that we see as part of our everyday spaces, restaurants or our outdoor exercise spaces that will proliferate more as well. And power centers and local power generation stations will not just be dumb boxes hidden away somewhere, but actually form part of the identity of communities and of the town centers. This one we've imagined here actually has a park on the top. But what's also more important is the energy that you have already. What do you do with that, and how do you use it in the best possible way? And one of the ways forward is really through density and mixed use. So as per the Pittsburgh example, you have different users using different amounts of energy at different times of the day. And if you manage to harness and balance those loads, you're able to get a lot better energy efficiency than you would if those were standalone users. So for example, if you had an office tower on top of a leisure center, the offices need to be predominantly cooled, so they have a lot of excess heat, and a leisure center with pools needs to constantly be warmed up. Now, if those were separated, you'd be using energy to cool one and heat the other, but if they were together, they could share energy, so the office rejected heat could heat up the swimming pool underneath. Similarly, if you had light industrial processes close to the community and close to the town centers, they usually have a lot of excess heat, which could be used to heat up homes. So beyond in-use energy, we also have to think about embodied energy, and that is how much energy we spend to create and to build our town centers. And really, we have to make sure that we use and reuse and reconfigure everything that we can from our existing building stock before we go to building. And when we do need to build new stuff, it has to be from lightweight materials, really as carbon neutral as possible, and integrating a lot of greenery and blue infrastructure to mitigate, to act as a carbon sink and to also help with flooding and water drainage. But beyond any technology, really what will make a town center the most sustainable is this diversity of activity and density of people that together will proliferate services and social connections. So you wouldn't have to travel very far for your basic daily needs. And that will make sure that the energy stays within the place and is not expended.
So as landlords, how do we respond to this? Well, landlords have the ability and the opportunity to facilitate the creation of sustainable resource networks, either larger landlords or networks of smaller landlords together. Both Daniela and Grigor have introduced energy as a collective resource, and we need to show leadership in this. So working with occupiers and our tenants who are actually using the energy to run these buildings more sustainably. An obvious way to start building on this and encouraging tenants to uptake green schemes is through green leases. This could be through either negotiating retrofitting programs or procuring green energy in our existing building stock. As Grigor mentioned, shared energy is key to reducing our energy consumption and transitioning to a low-carbon future. And investing in these processes now, and so adding value to create more sustainable buildings, will future-proof landlord investments. By 2030, tenants will be prioritizing green energy and buildings transitioning to net zero, whether that's through legislation or company policy. So adding green value now will secure more robust future lettings. So where a landlord or a group of landlords have the collective power to benefit their communities, with their tenants and occupiers benefiting, they must look to utilize this resource. One example is procuring green energy on a large scale as a landlord to benefit multiple tenants. An example is an initiative that we've started doing at Grosvenor, where we procure green energy from a provider at competitive rates. So this becomes a 6-monthly process to ensure that it's sort of the most innovative new technologies that are being used, but also for the competitive rates. And we can then encourage our tenants to purchase through this scheme at a much lower cost than if they were doing this independently, due to obvious economies of scale. Whilst this isn't something that we can force on tenants as landlords through green leases, it is something that should be looked at holistically for the sort of mutual benefit of both parties. Finally, an initiative that has gone further than this recently is our Tenant Sustainability Award. And our tenants have been encouraged to enter this competition, showcasing sustainability initiatives, green energy initiatives, with the winner being awarded a year's worth of energy billing, which obviously is a desirable incentive, but the purpose being to get the tenants really engaging with their community network, sharing ideas, and encouraging others on this journey to net zero and a more sustainable property sector.
So the second trend we're going to look at in terms of well-being is wellness architecture, which I think has been around for a few years now, and it's really about kind of getting well-being embedded into spaces and places, kind of looking more at the physical and mental side of well-being. And the reason why this has kind of come to the fore, especially, is that it's driven by the consumer realization that our environments and our surroundings do affect our well-being. So now 80% of the UK population are either slightly or very concerned about air pollution. But what's also interesting is there's a study by Nature England done that found that 45% of people had access to nature, said that access to nature was important to their mental well-being, and yet this is an area where inequality is rife. So you have 40% of people from ethnic minorities live in the most green space-deprived areas, and 29% of people living with a long-term illness or disability have not visited a natural space within a month of being surveyed. So what's really important as we think about wellness architecture into the future is not about just kind of making more green spaces, it's about how do you build that infrastructure that delivers on that collective well-being. In terms of who we think is leading the way in this area, so we've got CAPS, which stands for City Air Purification System, and this is in Hong Kong. So this is actually a commercially ready prototype that is all about kind of protecting people who live in populous cities by creating novel filtration and sanitization technologies. So this is actually a bus shelter, and the dual cone kind of mechanisms work to kind of create almost a bubble of clean air while you're waiting for your bus. Another example we have here is the Manchester Active Neighbourhood. So this is more about kind of physical well-being in terms of prioritizing movement, health, and safety of people over cars. So they've put in a lot of modal filters such as benches, planters, and bollards to kind of stop cars from coming through and kind of encouraging that movement. Another example that we've seen that's similar is Barcelona, which has their super blocks program, and they're actually pedestrianizing whole blocks of the city. And they really talk about it from an equality standpoint. They talk about, reducing noise pollution for the residents. They talk about that access to being outside for the elderly and also safety for children as well. The last example we have here is NUDES, which stands for Natural and Urban Devices, and is by designer Jose Maria Mateo Torres. And this is, again, about kind of thinking about wellness architecture from that access and equality standpoint. So he was thinking about how can we create a series of modules that allows us to embed wellness architecture anywhere. So these modules are kind of plug-and-play wellness architecture to create greener environments, a locally produced food. So for example, one of them is a miniature forest on top of a roof, and another one is kind of a micro vertical urban farm. So he's thinking about how can we embed wellness architecture into already existing spaces.
Okay, so here we're shifting scales from the big strategic thinking to down the street and the user and the visitor of the town center's experience. So taking on the examples that Daniela's introduced, and we've really taken a bit more artistic license here. Thinking about this air purification bus stop integrated as a continuous infrastructure along a high street or a shopping mall, and that providing almost like a blanket of clean, purified air for the entire street, suddenly turning the space into a much healthier alternative to being at home. So you might actually come back and start shopping on the high street just because you've got a better environment to be in. And that infrastructure then starts to host a number of other wellness-related activities like urban sports, and it could have mobility hubs featuring electric bike charging stations and encouraging outdoor sports. And on its upper level, we imagine, again, perhaps a linear park, which will give access to even city center dwellers. It will give even city center dwellers immediate access to green space. And perhaps this is, again, encouraging movement, encouraging running, and cycling, and it's a way of moving faster through the city, whereas this lower area here is about lingering. And making the city healthy isn't just about the devices, but it's also seeing other people being active and doing things, and that's likely to encourage more activity. And in terms of the upper floors, again, a lot of the existing building stock in urban centers has no access to any form of outdoor green amenity. So if we take the example of the natural urban devices that Daniela has introduced, we can have these plug-in structures that will come into our buildings and be retrofitted, and they will probably be expressed as retrofitted as well, that will give us individual and communal outdoor spaces. And finally, it's not just about looking green and healthy, it's also about the data and the digital representation of this. And we believe that the Future Town Center will have a lot of screens and a lot of publicly shared data about the energy consumption and the air quality and other factors, the greening factor of the city that will then drive footfall and make cities more popular based on their health and wellness credentials. Sorry, came out too early.
So, as Daniela mentioned, 80% of people are concerned about air pollution and 45% want more accessibility to nature. So what can we do as landlords and how should we be responding? Well, it's now increasingly easy to measure and monitor air quality, so that's an easy starting point. We've seen a few examples of trials using new innovation and technology to improve air quality in existing spaces, and the results from those sort of trials and the data is becoming increasingly important, as signposted here in Grigor's drawing. We have trialled some software recently in our shopping centres in Sweden, which, whilst the trial proved that the air quality in the shopping centres was consistently high, the analysis did show that we could optimise the performance while simultaneously saving energy and costs. The trial proved successful and showed potential savings in energy, thermal energy, carbon and costs, but it was also a prime opportunity to use new technology to really enhance well-being for the benefit of our occupiers and community. So with communities and occupiers using these spaces with a much deeper understanding now of air quality and well-being standards than previously, we must do more to further enhance our existing spaces. So the use of green walls, green roofs, enhancing biodiversity and cleaning the air, creating environments that people really enjoy lingering in, like this example here, is really important. And it's clear that these trends and consumer habits and the sort of obvious accelerated climate change point to more sustainable investments, being those that aim for carbon neutrality, enhancing well-being through sustainable initiatives in the future.
So now we're going to move on to our final pillar, and we're going to go whistle-stop tour of it. I know I already talk fast, so I'm probably just going to talk faster. So our final pillar is for everyone, and we know that it's a challenging time for retail, but as we've been trying to kind of say, it's also that time to build back better, and it's why we call this last pillar for everyone, because the future of town center will have to be built with different needs and use cases in mind, and that requires flexible thinking, a sense of mutual benefit between consumers, landlords, businesses, developers, and residents. So when we think about this in the cultural context, we know that consumers are kind of living in different places. They're outside of city centers now, so we need to draw them back. So we can see here 46.4% of people were now working from home. They're not shopping and spending in the same way that they were in the past. And so we really like this quote from Paul Martin, who talks about the fact that high streets have to become multi-purpose location with a variety of uses: residential, education, healthcare, cultural, technology, community, and purpose-focused retail and hospitality. So what this means in terms of kind of that consumer context is that there's a changing engagement with our local areas, and the parameters of our lives have generally shrunk, so we're less kind of dependent on going to those traditional city centers. So how are we going to draw them back? And two ways that we are seeing kind of businesses do that is through flex-use spaces and kind of new hangout centers. So to start off with the flex-use spaces, so I think flexibility is a really crucial mindset for developers, landlords, and businesses as they kind of try and attract people back to their spaces. And we've seen this before, this kind of pop-up mentality has become a bit more of a permanent way of doing business. But it's not only about creating kind of transient pop-up commerce, it's also about kind of enabling brands who don't have the capital themselves, perhaps online-only brands, kind of drawing them into the high street and allowing them to get that exposure. It's also about creating kind of an ever-evolving curation of stores to entice customers back. And when we think of who's leading the way here, so we have TX Huihei Youth Energy Center, which is based in China. So here is, they call it a curated retail mall. So the real estate developer and the mall owners actually kind of got retailers from Taobao. So Taobao is one of China's most popular shopping apps. So they found retailers who had a really strong social following, had really strong sales, and they offered them a 3-month lease in the mall. And the revenue model is not based on rent, but is actually based on offering up the space in exchange for a percentage of the store sales. So trying to kind of bring that online into the offline world. Another company that was trying to do that was Enterprise Nation and SumUp. So they had a pop-up in Oxford Circus where they invited online sellers to kind of enter this world of physical retail. They gave them this great exposure on Oxford Street, but they also gave them kind of training and learning how to create an experiential retail experience and also a hybrid approach to selling. The last example that we have here is TBC Bank, which is in Georgia, the country, not the state. And this is kind of reflective of the flexi-use space more from the end consumer mindset. So this is the bank's new flagship, and it is over 4 floors and actually has 11 different zones based on kind of what they're going to be used for. So they have all these different functions. There's exhibition and presentation halls, there's a library, a cafe, co-working spaces, as well as personal banking zones as well. So this is really about creating that flexi-use space designed for the uses of the community as well.
Okay, so in terms of flexibility and buildings, there are 2 ways to think about it. The first one is buildings that are designed, or spaces that are designed to be flexible. So if we take the Youth Energy Center example, that is effectively a infrastructure for short-term, small space rentals where brands come and go and they're really quick and exciting, and the space is really a platform, almost like a media platform, where things can be plugged in and out, turned around very quickly. And the purpose of that is to create excitement and to bring brands that wouldn't actually make it onto the high street or in a shopping center or in a conventional retail environment into the town center, and for the visitors to create this opportunity to see something new every time they arrive. So we've thought about this, and throughout the flexibility theme of using existing spaces that are not changed very much, they're just tweaked. So for example here, if you took several separated units on a high street and you combine them and you built a bit of infrastructure, you could actually have this really interesting fast turnaround space. Secondly, flexibility is about how we think about using existing spaces. So what traditionally would have been one occupier and with single use, let's say retail at the ground and then some stockrooms at the top, could now be all sorts of different things. Could be a small retail frontage just to signify presence, with a logistics or fulfillment hub at the back, and then you have libraries, learning, workplaces, food and beverage. This could be provided by separate occupiers or by one kind of more holistic provider like the TBC Bank described by Daniela. The key thing is to think about circulation and separate access, and that's where we've imagined taking out bits of buildings on the high streets and creating these extra external spaces that can now serve as independent access to all floors. Poppy?
So we've seen that e-commerce has provoked much more short-term trends, and whilst the opportunity for things to change as quickly as they do online can't be fully replicated in our high street, by encouraging these more flexi-use, time-based rents, the high street can keep up. Grigor mentioned splitting up spaces that traditionally were rented to one tenant. So it's, again, a running theme throughout this presentation is flexibility. So flexibility in leases and time-based rents is something that we're seeing more of, and a trend that looks like it's going to continue well on into the future. An interesting case that we're going to touch on is the success of Souk, of which one of the stores is located on South Moulton Street. So Sook's strapline is from the digital world to a physical space with the touch of a button, which is a fairly accurate description of what they're doing. This business is essentially enabling time-based rents for businesses who want to take the concept of the pop-up even further. So a business can come in here, use the space, materials, screens, designs, and set themselves up and showcase their business in a much more flexible time and in much more flexible locations. So this is really about bringing the digital into physical spaces. And also similar to the example that Daniela spoke about on Oxford Street with Enterprise Nation and SumUp. So the success has shown that a transition to more time-based, short, flexible leasing works well in the existing market where small businesses want the opportunity to trial their brand or USP with the consumer.
So now for our last trend, which is called new hangout centers. So one thing that we have lost in the last 2 years is kind of a lot of the casual interactions that we used to have as everything moved online and we kind of stayed within our local vicinity. And there have been studies that show that these casual interactions, they're known as weak ties. They're actually very important to our sense of well-being, happiness, and belonging. So people who have more weak ties tend to feel more connected to their community. So saying hi to your barista, going to a local yoga class. So what we're seeing now is retailers are kind of giving up the square footage to offer these moments of connection between people, kind of creating hangout spaces where lounging and socializing is just as important as the shopping that can be done there. In terms of who's leading the way here, we've got the Commons, which is a mall based in Bangkok. So what they've done is they actually offer 30% of the space is open air and open to the public to use. So they have a kitchen, an art space, an outdoor lawn, and 2 studios, and they have kind of the sharing economy as an inspiration point for how it works. So they allow all the spaces on the upper floors to be booked by locals to kind of do whatever they want. If they want to host a jam or do some yoga, they're welcome to do so. The other example we have here is the Playhouse, and this is in Tokyo. And this is a store that has actually been specifically designed for a post-COVID world. So the designer said the majority of shopping will be done online. The physical retail store must offer more than just products. So the entire building is kind of designed with transformable architectural elements in mind. So for instance, on the ground floor of the shopping area, every space has rotatable walls. So the way that the floor is kind of laid out can change depending on what they're using it for. The last example we have here is La Samaritaine, which is in Paris and recently just opened. So this is a 19th century department store that fell into disuse. It was closed for the last 16 years and now is opening again to much fanfare. But it's not only a luxury department store. It also has offices, residents, and a local nursery for workers in the area. And it also has 96 social housing units as well. So again, bringing back that accessibility point as well. It also has 2 restaurants, 10 casual eateries. There's a coffee shop that roasts its own beans. So again, trying to cater to the needs of the local community as well as being just a fabulous place to shop as well.
So in terms of the architecture, we don't think the Hangout Center is a specific building topology. It's more of a cluster of spaces and activities where people would come and do different things and form social connections and have casual interactions with each other. And it's really this idea that it's for everyone, people from all demographics, ages, and occupations. And what we're really interested in architecturally is how certain uses lend themselves to being at a certain height. So for example, if we take the Commons precedent that Daniela just introduced, we can imagine that that would be quite well accommodated near a roof of a building where you can have a green roof terrace and all sorts of community spaces such as function spaces, music studios, dance halls, art classes, connected to that and forming almost like an urban square up in the air. And going down to the ground and first and basement levels are still fairly good for retail, the kind of showcase, adaptable, transformable retail that the Playhouse exemplifies. And the middle layers are usually longer-term occupations such as so workplace, leisure, health and well-being, collaborative working, or different types of spa and treatments. So what we have here is a cluster of activities that can happen at many separate places, but the richness and the value that this would add is their connection and their potential for overlapping and for casual interaction and connections between the different activities. And we thought of this example as being a department store that is converted to all these interesting things with its central escalator atriums kept, so they form that continuous connection between the different activities. And like many others, we think that would work even better as a front door to a higher density, longer term use, such as residential, like in the Samartan example, or hotel or workplace, where it would give it a permanent population that would use these spaces and activate them and really bring everyone together, as is the aspiration. Poppy?
So the beauty of restructuring and redeveloping these large spaces from a landlord perspective is this partial element of control. What goes where, selecting who might be on this ground floor, leading people in and making people linger. Encouraging green walls for well-being, spaces to hang out, for co-working, grabbing a coffee, perhaps short-term pods. And if a landlord really knows their community and has engaged with networks of tenants around that community, then they can pull together these moving parts to really optimize the success of these future hangout centres. We're going to briefly look at an example of 25 Eccleston Yards and why it's proven to be such a success. So this is really a community-led space of living, working, exercising, eating, drinking, and sort of this like moving between the indoor and the outdoor has really allowed for this sense of connection. It was previously an old warehouse site, so this is a real reflection of the success of giving a new lease of life to a space. And the feedback here has very much been that this is a model of just the landlord as a platform for a tenant's or an operator's success. So the key here is highlighting the importance again of landlord and tenant engagement for mutual success. So as we conclude this presentation today, we are sure that you've noticed the huge overlap across these three pillars of community, well-being, and for everyone, and how interconnected these future trends are. So mutual benefit and success comes from these moving parts all working together. And a final example that we're going to talk about, which we think illustrates this very nicely, is a partnership of landlords and community groups who've put together a project called the Wild West End in central London. The sort of concept behind this was that partnership together creates a much bigger impact, and so the purpose is to create these green corridors and green networks across our city centre with people working together to create spaces that the community can stay in, linger in, and enjoy. And this finally explores this idea of stewardship, and as landlords, stewardship is something that's extremely important. And whilst landlords can drive from the top down, working together with other stakeholders, so tenants, community groups, local councils, and creating a network together to drive positive supply chains creates the future town centre that we think we all want to see. Thank you very much for listening.